Hi, here is Markku Wilenius, your traveling futurist. And this time I have a pleasure to talk with Cecily Sommers, who is a very renowned futurist. Cecily, could you start by talking your way through how you actually became a futurist?
So I'm known as a business futurist. And first of all, I want to say hello and thank you for having me as a part of these traveling conversations. Your travels took you today to Minneapolis, Minnesota in the US, which is where I'm based and where I have made my career as a futurist for the last 25 years. And so my version of being a futurist, I really lean towards what's known as strategic foresight because I'm primarily a strategist who does foresight at the fuzzy front end of strategy and innovation, the places where we very genuinely say, we don't know. And,
Mhm.
one of the things that foresight allows us to do is to ask good questions and think things through and start to get a map of the conditions that we want to navigate so that ideally organizations and people too, it's the same principles. When we can say, given who we are, what do we want for the future? That and what's our value in that future, and foresight's such a beautiful tool to allow that to be for people. So that's the kind of work that I've been doing, as I said, to close to 25 years now, and I love it. It's fascinating, and it has also taken me into, again, what I view as the same work strategy, of course, is a vision of a future and a plan to get there. Innovation is what you do in order to realize that future, and leadership, who you have to be in order to hold those big ideas and marshal the resource, the talent, the purpose to over time to do that. So strategy, innovation, and leadership are the domains in which I work.
Very well.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's being a strategist, but in a particular way, which is why we call it in among us futurists as a strategic foresight. So it's kind of a strategy based foresight in a way. But before going into that, I also would like to tease out a little bit of you. Uh, uh, how do you how did you become a futurist? I know that you had some careers before that, in a ballet and also working with natural health. So how did this kind of paved your way to become a futurist?
Yeah, thanks for asking. I mean, people, when you say you're a futurist, I'm sure you get this all the time. First, people want to know, well, what is that, right? And it's a way of looking at the forces of change that help us do that. The other question that follows is, and how did you get there? And I don't think there are
Right,
too many children who say, I want to be a futurist when I grow up.
right.
Um, and in fact, what I wanted to be when I grew up, there were two images I had in my head. One of them was that I wanted to be a dancer, which was in fact what I did do as my first career. And interestingly, when I was young, there is an image that I had early on, probably from a book or something. It was like, I want to be a Renaissance woman. And for me, it was like an image of being in literary salons in Paris with, music and the arts and that stimulation of let's be really in the world of ideas and pushing those ideas to the fore. So I would say those two things have been alive in me throughout the course of my life. So I did.
Right.
I became a professional dancer, ballet and contemporary dance as well. And then I made a change. There are some many stories in here, including the fact that um, I went away for pre-professional training, graduated, went into my first job as a ballet dancer, and then decided that I did want to go to college. And in that time, I was introduced to taking anatomy and physiology, and
Mm.
I had more of a talent and a knack for it than I would ever have expected. It was a surprise. And so for me, I'm indulging in this story, if you don't mind. For
No.
me, when I was looking into cadavers, and some people might go, ugh, I was like, oh my gosh, this is so fascinating. And what dawned on me is that science and art were asking the same questions. These kind of big questions about who are we, and what is the design of who we are, and how is it that we bring that into expression. And even though it may be a body that no longer has life in it, we of course are looking for ways for how we do that. So that work informed my training, my teaching, and I went on to dance with other companies and also taught dance kinesiology and ballet as I went. And at some point decided that while my dream of being a dancer had come true, that I wasn't happy. And I had to wrestle with some of the questions that I believe many of us find of, what happens when your dream comes true and that's no longer holds you. And so for me, I knew that I needed to be happy when I was feeding my mind. That, in fact, was my state of greatest bliss. How could I do that and still maintain my dance career so that I could travel the world and have this Renaissance life I had envisioned? And I decided to become a chiropractor, in part because it would allow me to be a primary care physician where I could also study Chinese medicine, which I did, and classical homeopathy, which I did. And I moved into that work and realized that being a doctor also meant, in fact, being a business person.
Mm-hmm.
So that was the dawning of my interest in business, which I began to love and relate to as the biggest creative platform there is. And I really loved the management of it and the branding in it. And I was teaching throughout all this time anatomy and clinical sciences, and then ultimately business classes as well. So in 1998, I sold my clinics. I had several, and closed my art gallery, which I also had, and I went into consulting, and that was brand strategy consulting, asking kind of the core questions, which I think, again, animate all strategy, again, business, society, and for ourselves, of who are you and where are you going? We have to know our purpose. We have to know how the environment is changing so that we stay relevant. And that work in brand strategy, which focused on trends as well, took me into foresight. I launched a nonprofit called the Push Institute, and a big international conference that was a hit for many years called the Push Conference, and wrote a book and consulting, speaking, and so forth. So the foresight came, after the trends just felt too static, and that I was mostly interested in going into that systemic view, as I had done as a doctor across many different disciplines. Chinese medicine, which has its own model, Western medicine has its own model, so does homeopathy and others. And to be able to scan those models from the roots of what was happening across different theories and begin to tease out, how are we going to make this diagnosis? How are we going to create a path for, in this case, healing? And it was always distinct and different. But that view really shaped how I do my work today. I think I draw on my background as an artist very much, and understanding the discipline of creativity and the comfort with ambiguity. And then, of course, being a trained systems thinker and diagnostician and teacher has really served me in my work in foresight for all this time that I've been practicing. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. Fascinating journey, really. And it brought me to think, that when we think about the history of the future studies, we see that there is a lot of this kind of a pondering about whether this is science or whether this is art or whether it is actually something combined. And but then it has to have also this kind of a third dimension, which is kind of a deep dimension, kind of a depth dimension, which is which is what you said, systemic thinking, which is that we need to connect the dots, and that we need. So we need this creative part, we need this rational part, and we need to have this capacity to build the connections, understanding first of all what are the dots, and secondly what are the connections between those dots. And so that is something, and you have gone that kind of a picking those fruits as you go, and those experiences and skills and understandings and insights, and paved your way to become a futurist. And I would love to ask you this question: that when did you start to realize that there is a particular way to think as a futurist?
I think I was introduced to it probably by Andrew Zolli, who became a friend. And I loved his thinking, his way of framing where we are now, where things may be headed, talking about the implications of it. And so I think that may have been among the first ideas. And I'm aware that, of course, I also had been pushing on that myself. Is that, that's the name of the PUSH Institute, was that we weren't necessarily wanting to do specific predictions of trends in the near term. That's what I was interested in doing, but to really look at the roots of change, and in my vernacular, at what's pushing the future in new directions. In other words, what's emergent and how do we track it? And to do that, you really have to look under the surface of those trends to find what's their kind of motivating roots. And so
Yeah.
I think, as a systems thinker, I wasn't satisfied, and I just felt like we needed to go deeper to really understand change.
Mm-hmm. Indeed. And that's exactly what I wanted to pick this conversation right now, because if future studies as a discipline is a scientific discipline, then I would describe it as a science of change, actually. How A becomes B and B becomes C, and what are those factors that make these things happen, so that we learn something. We look at the history, and we look at how things have moved and how changed and transformations of all kinds, and then we learn from there. But yet again, all the changes are always unique in their own sense. You can frame them in a certain way. Yes, you can understand the forces, but they are also unique of their kind. But you see the patterns. You can understand that something around that. So. So how was your thinking about the change and understanding the change and being delivered to your audiences or to your clients about more about understanding the change? Did it at some point became like your kind of a core focus, or how would you describe that?
Yeah, I'm lucky enough in a way to have always created my professional life out of what I love and believe. So, my convictions have led me, and I can't help but really see and share how I see things. So that came very naturally for me. And perhaps a good example is, for instance, in 2004, someone who was about to become the CEO of a large electric utility asked me to do a report, and it became the Energy Foresight Report. And, the need was, energy consumption only goes up. How are we going to meet that demand? Given that we're in a position that if we are going to meet that demand, the construction of some kind of energy generation plant, whether it be coal, gas, nuclear, otherwise, is exceedingly expensive. At the time, it was, I think, $14 billion and about 10 years to do. So that need to kind of anticipate what's the climate going to be like in terms of regulatory climate, the social climate, the markets, where should we place our bets? And that's really what people are asking when they're taking a look at the future. Where should we place our bets? And in that situation, it seems really natural for me, for instance, to say, we have to look at all the systems. We have to look at, what are supplier countries doing and what are the geopolitics of that? What are the countries that don't have natural supply, for instance, islands like Japan, doing? And how are all of these political forces shaping it, which shape the economies of it? And where then, again, in the US, for instance, would be the regulatory incentives? What is the social readiness to shift to new forms? There were a number of things that went into that, as well as new technologies that were emerging for how ready in 2004 are we for alternative sources? Will the investment be backed, et cetera, et cetera? So we have to look across everything. And, it was in that way that I was formulating my own model already. I found, it's very classic. I wonder if your audience will be familiar with, there are two acronyms that are often used to studying the forces of change: STEEP, or PESTLE, which is just a rearrangement of them. Society, technology, economics, environment, and people, or politics, right? And personally, I felt like they could be further distilled. And so I came up with something that serves me very well. I still find a lot of value in it, and distill them to the four forces of change. That we are first in every society where people come together to produce together and find security and take care of each other, is that they are dependent mostly on resources. So natural resources is like the first determinant of how things are going to go. Second is technology. What are the tools that we have to harvest those resources and make secondary product and imagine a future we want to create? Next is demographics. What's the mix in the group that's going to keep it strong over time with gender and fertility and, of course, labor and skill? And then last is governance. How is it that any group of people comes up with the rules of cooperation, rules of law and rules of the market in particular, and the incentives that get built in that? And they kind of work in that order, in my view, with governance being that human agency, which is most reactive at the top, most informed by our worldviews, most informed by culture as it's changing too. So that's the model, when you had asked, that I use. And, when I talk to people, we can say every trend has its roots in those four forces. And if we scan them, we can look for those early signals of change. And it tells us where the potentials are for the future, such that we can imagine and develop scenarios, et cetera.
I want to ask one question about that forces of change that you just described, these four forces. I am often asked about that. Isn't it so that the technology is coming ever more important because we're simply producing more and more that? We have more and more layers in our infrastructure, in overall in our society, that kind of determines the way that we live, we work, we basically run our individual lives as we run our societies. And isn't then everything else becoming a secondary because of these huge investments that have been put there, simply that all the other aspect, demographics, governance, and even natural resources would kind of stay on the sort of on the second around there. What is your answer to that? What is your take on that type of the challenge? So,
Yeah, it is. It is a challenging question, I think, and because I have to pause to consider, does it really upend everything? Um, it certainly is the only force that has the exponential effects. And so, in that way, it's dominant for sure. Is it primary? I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I mean, it still remains true that, if we have a huge tsunami or an earthquake or massive droughts and fires, that's remains pretty primary. If we don't have people, the technology is irrelevant. And if we can't manage ourselves, which is the governance layer, things are anarchic, which is a little bit of what's happening. So technology then becomes a tool that's layered into. So there is no other, I would say resources, demographics, and governance are no longer pure. They have technology embedded in them also. It's almost like a through line. So that's probably how I would regard it today.
mm-hmm.
And, our views and understanding keep evolving as the world does. But today, that's how I understand it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I was thinking, since you mentioned Japan, who famously not only is being sort of a heavily dependent on the import of the energy sources, but also that who who experienced a massive earthquake a bit more than 10 years ago, and as a result of that, they had a lot of problems with their nuclear reactors. But what I want to say here is that then this human factor behind that, which was that they were not sort of able to govern this shock that came there, probably made the whole event much worse than it would have been otherwise if they had been kind of quick enough to follow what was going on in that nuclear station, and that they would have been able to go much faster to try to kind of solve the key problem, which was then because of this massive tsunami that came on their shores. Now, all this I wanted just to point out that when we're talking about the technology, there is always the human factor there at play, and so and there is actually also the case, I would say, that whenever we adapt technologies, it doesn't have very straightforward way. There can be inventors that have thought one thing, but then when we start to apply, particularly on the massive scale, and you can take the whole history from telephones to mobile phones to whatever gadget almost, that it takes time to mature the technology before it is adopted in a certain way. So the technology itself is not very kind of a straightforward thing. And as you said, also what the technology does these days is that it is embedded almost everywhere in a way that was not probably the case just some time ago. So that also builds a kind of a case for the technology. But I totally agree that we still need to kind of we cannot kind of arrive very straightforward into this conclusion that, well, technology is everything, even if it looks sometimes at that, because there are always, as long as we are running as human beings, these societies, there's always these human factors, and with that comes a lot of things about whether it's about the demographics, whether it's about dealing the issues that how do we actually deal with the natural resources. So my question to you is actually in this regard is that as we are becoming more complex as societies, what is the human factor there? How would you describe the role of the human being and our capacity to deal with this exponential growth that has been sort of propagated by the technologies, but also this massive expansion of human societies in terms of population growth and so forth?
Yeah. I'm just going to pause and say that one of the things that I believe, and it's linked to the human capacity. So, Mother Nature, in my view, will always have the last word. And, it is reactive to our actions as well, and is more powerful than we are, as much as we're trying to engineer it. It really is a bigger system than any human system can be. So that's an interesting thing to consider about resources. And then in the human factor, sadly, humans have never, as futurists, this is part of the heartbreak we carry. Humans don't like to think ahead. Not really. We like fantasies, that kind of thinking ahead, but we don't like really anticipating the future and being planful for it very well. Mostly what we do is we manage from crisis to crisis. And as long as things are good, there's something that I refer to as the permanent present. When things are good, we believe we have made it and we have sorted it out, and this is the new stability. And when things are bad, we think that everything is now going to hell in a handbasket and that this is the apocalypse, and that, and we start to be reactive. So I do believe part of the human nature, sadly, even though we have great tools that help us to prognosticate and anticipate, we get so caught up in our own self-interest and comforts that we're really poor at doing anything more than, we're mostly just very reactive. And in the arena of governance, that last layer that I talk about, we want our leaders, our political and governmental leaders, to lead. And in fact, this is the most reactive layer because humans are reactive. And so that doesn't fully answer your question, but it does I want to establish that I think this is the nature of it. Doesn't mean that we don't have the capacity to do better, which is why we do the work that we do. And in that capacity, I really believe that, people's sense of instability, one is to try to react and get more control, right? Which is, I think, a losing proposition long term. The other one is to be more spacious in our ability to understand change. That's what we're doing. I talk about change literacy. I am really interested because I believe that this isn't hard. This is not hard to understand, to get just kind of a basic literacy of how change works, how we can perceive it. Then we map it into how we think, how we process the information, and so forth. Mapping also to that change literacy, I think we ourselves as humans, I'm deeply committed to this as well, need to really build a reservoir of wisdom, which is not something that we actively cultivate, sadly. And I think this is kind of the well and resource that we have that is the one we need to dig in the most. We are in a time of profound reactivity and all of the division. We are taking things apart. And wisdom is the part that allows us to read the change, hold all of it from, frankly, a non-dual point of view. It is complex, and there's no way that we can simplify it. That's the reality of it. And then can we really start to move to a place where, in the high perspective that futurists take, looking down, what is going to be the simplest route to the greatest good for all? Understanding there's no one answer, but there are some thoughtful answers. And there are things to try and things to bring people around thoughtfully. And,
Very.
foresight for me is about being thoughtful.
Yeah, yeah. So, in a way, I very feel strongly about your observations. That I would even argue that almost like paradoxically, the more we have advanced in our societies when it comes to the creating welfare in a kind of a standard sense of the word, um, we have somewhat lost our capacity to be reflective, and that is because the world seems to be demanding from us all the time more very fast reactions to this, reactions to that. Somebody's asking, somebody's doing something. We are communicating in so many different channels. So that is something that we are not questioning ourselves. Or if you think about the boards of the companies, that are they able to reflect? Do they spend time with more strategic reflections, or do they have to always to be working on what's going on now and burning platforms and all that kind of stuff? But it seems to me that the world, unless we put a very particular effort, uh, we tend to be more short-term focused because of this context in which we are living is changing to that type of the direction. So it's the same thing as to say that, well, according to some studies and measurements, our capacity to be focused is going down almost as we speak. It's been going now for the last 20 years. And that is also to say that unless we are really putting our mind into that, we are getting more short term, more kind of a dealing with our present problems. And I guess this is part of the reasoning why in your career you said that you have now moved more into this kind of a realm of inner transformation to understand humans as individuals and as collectives, and started to work with them. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, thank you. Um, yeah, I relate to foresight primarily as thinking technologies, right? And I wrote a book called Think Like a Futurist. And I believe again that at a certain level, change literacy is important, that we can share these ways of seeing and thinking things through. It's really as simple as that. So for me, I have really focused on helping people and teams to think, see, and lead like a futurist. And in the leadership realm, it is about taking some of the core qualities of foresight, which include, in my view, one of non duality. Things are not linear. To every question that we have, is it going to be bad? Is it going to be good? Do we need to be more reflective and contemplative in our leadership? And do we also need to, respond to burning platforms? The answer is yes. So the answer to the future is yes. It is all happening at once. And so our ability, again, to see and hold that is really important. So for leading like a futurist, that capacity to not force ourselves into black and white decisions, to be able to zoom out, which is part of this reflective mindset or the contemplative mindset, is can we move way up in observing not just the systems of change outside ourselves, but within ourselves. Because at the end of the day, the only thing that where action stems from is from each individual. So our individual capacity really, really has to deepen. So taking that meta perspective view and becoming really skilled in that. And as in businesses, we need to be able to zoom out and see the view inside and outside, and then zoom back in for that urgent environment in which they're operating. And that kind of, sometimes I talk about you need to be a zoomologist and really have facility for doing that. And that takes some training.
Mm-hmm.
So the non-duality, meaning the complexity of the time, the meta perspective, that inside of that we are watching emergence. Change is not, we tend to go from event to event, but in fact, the viewpoint of a futurist that I think needs to be adopted is that no, all of change is emergent. And that includes, again, within ourselves too. How do we watch the signals of change that are emerging within ourselves, within the organization, within society, within all of these forces? Because our job is to align them. And then the other part of it is what I've already mentioned. I would categorize all of this under the rubric of change literacy. Do we really understand where change comes from and how it's rooted within ourselves as well as the environment? And can we align the two? When we do, we are much more likely to find the relevance and resiliency, and frankly, as a business, the long-term revenue that we need. We are evolving ourselves, ideally, at the pace of change at which the world is changing. And the irony, the paradox there is, in order to evolve faster, we slow down, to your point. We slow down on the inside and become more reflective. It's how we manage all those changes. Yeah.
Very good. Very good. I remember you saying somewhere that we need to be philosophical before we become practical.
Yeah.
And I guess that was another way to say that that we need to have this reflective approach to get us to the point that, okay, what do we actually do next? So when you start to work with organizations, how do you start that? How do you put them to kind of to shake a little bit, perhaps, or at least to kind of to reconsider some of the mental beliefs and that they have at place? How do you do that type of the intervention?
Really, what I do is I just listen to what is it that they really need. So very often, it can happen in a couple of ways. A client may come and say, we have this project, we'd like your help. Here's what we believe we need. And so often I'm just listening and poking at, why is this important to you really? What it is, what's the true issue that stakes? Sometimes we need to dig a little deeper to an underlying issue than the one that they've named. And so we just spent a little bit of time really framing that. So once we've done that, let me just say that the real motivation of almost every business project is we want to grow, right? we want to, that's, our job is to grow strong, make sure that our market share is, always growing as well, and that our margins are good, and that our reputation is good, and that we are the best of the best. So everything always has that halo in it, and that you can just assume is part of it. And I think as a futurist, I feel this way about my work. I need to respect that, right? That is the truth about how a business is designed. So let's make sure that when we take this work on, that it is in fact answering a real need that people have in the most sincere and genuine way possible, in a way that uses your proprietary advantage, your resources, your point of view, your philosophy, your promise, your purpose. When we look at that future, we've really considered who people are and where they're going and what they need. And that's where the foresight comes in. And we've really considered why you're the one who can manage and meet that need in a really beautiful way. Then we can start to get to work. So in that work, we're scoping the research, and that's where there's an even deeper level of digging and where all the good insight comes, because then the questions really get philosophical first in how far I dig into the issue that they want to address. So I can bring examples to the fore, but generically that's how I do it.
Yeah, very good. One thought came to my mind where you were describing this understanding the needs, which I think is a wonderful way to look at that. But at the same time, sometimes, and frankly, according to my experience, quite often, people or organization cannot actually pinpoint what they need is. They just feel that something is not right, it's not working well, maybe their business is going down, but they don't know what they actually need. They might see something around there, but that's a kind of a big cloud, above them that they it's hard to see through, and so. Correct me if I'm wrong, but what we need to be doing is actually a little bit this type of the guiding work to actually to get to their real needs, and this is not something that you can actually produce. You need to produce them together with them, and only in this kind of an interaction communication you kind of you search your way to actually to get to that point where you say, oh yeah, this is actually what you need. Is this something that you agree with, or
yeah, very much so. I refer to it that most people start with a hunch, because after all, we don't know what the future holds. But there is usually kind of an aura of anxiety around the hunch. There's an opportunity we should go get, and everybody else is doing. What's going to be our position on it? There is a challenge coming at us that we want to make sure that we're prepared for. There's just a crazy idea we think we would love to be able to achieve. What would it take? And it's always, so I describe it as a hunch. And so when they have a hypothesis about the hunch. We should do this because, right? And do you agree effectively? And tell us how we're going to sort this out. And that opens up, a lot of really wonderful conversation on the front end. I think that's what you're describing too. And again, it's it's an interview process of tell me more about this, and you have to do some sleuthing, some interrogation of why does this matter to you? Well, it's because we're afraid, if we don't, we're going to lose X. We're overinvested. Our infrastructure is overinvested in the supply chain here. Whatever it may be, where there are demographic changes, and we think that those demographic changes are going to, influence how people relate to our products. We want to make sure that people, have the same values, that we can appeal to them across different types of cultures, and or will they bring in different practices which makes us irrelevant? How do we cross that bridge? So, and again, that's why for me, all this work necessarily implies innovation opportunities, that like almost always it's pointing out, great, we have seen the future, which is where we get to in the first phase, our second phase of the work. After we've done all the research and the discovery, we can go into what might this look like. And we're like, we have identified some real potential spaces where this might happen. Then we get to reverse engineer it and talk about what's it going to look like to build it. And that's when we get to, a now to future portfolio of ideas and projects that are actionable. Once we have seen a future that really feels like ours to build, how far out is that? Is it 5 years from now, 10 years from now? What's the halfway point? What's 2 years from now? What's 1 year from now? What do we need to be doing? What kinds of resources, partnerships, et cetera, will we need in order for that future to be the thing we created? Yeah.
Yeah. I think, in a way, when we're talking about this kind of using better our anticipatory capacities, understanding better what are the types of forces that have impact on us, and what are the type of the forces that do not have impact on us. This is all about sort of preparing for the future, preparing, knowing that we don't never have a right answer, but kind of a building the universe that is in the sort of a front of us in such a way that it gives kind of a I would say energy. Energy is maybe the right term to think about. To what are you actually doing? Because you cannot actually create more knowledge, because knowledge is always something about things that has already happened. But these capacities to either to proactively reach out or to react fast when something happens is something that is this kind of an anticipatory capacity we're talking about. So when you get to the stage where you start to see that people in the organization start to connect the dots in a different way, because through the conversations and exercises that you have done, you have built kind of open the eyes maybe to issues that they haven't seen before. How do you actually guide them then to the next step, which is that, okay, now that we have built the universe, now that we understand our universe better, where is our path in there? Where is that how do you help them to focus?
Personally, I start there. I've been known as the practical futurist at times because I always start with wanting to solve a very real and present business problem. So that's my guiding light, and that's how I scope my research. So, we are looking at what's the domain of interest that we're wanting to speak to. The example I used earlier around a utility company. They have something at stake. And so I always feel like I want to start with what's at stake first, and then scope my research across those four forces to take a look at what are the implications for this key interest. And I'll do that at looking at a kind of a global level first. Mm-hmm. Here's what we're seeing in society around these four forces that affect your business interest. Then we'll take a look at, and so what it means for society that you live in, your industry, your particular business, and your location. So I'm already threading right from the beginning, and I take them through those layers so that we're seeing implications right from the start. I need to work that way because otherwise I feel like the future and the world is too big. Right? We're not wanting to boil the ocean every time. That's the choice that I've made. I really want to say, how do we scope, like really see that telescope, the part of the universe where we're factoring in the forces of the universe as they impact you. And so I take them through from, global to social to industry to, business, so that it's really starting to be something like, oh, that's where the insights are. So how I get them is, I think what your question was, is where do we get the traction and the buy-in? part of this is the buy-in is there, especially when we're able to thread the insight. Look at what this opportunity is. And the business case is there for it right from the start. So that's the way I work. It's the only way I work. I really not sure how to approach it differently. Yeah.
Well, okay. Well, then this is something that comes out of you naturally,
Yeah.
and of course, that's probably where you are most talented as well. So it's like a falls into your profile. So, Cecily, I really have enjoyed this conversation, and I think we're going to continue these conversations. It's truly been magnificent to hear your views and get to know you and your ideas and really your book about how to think like a futurist is available. But can you also tell more how people can reach you, where they can see more of your work?
Yes, be happy to. So I know that we have some conversations coming up where we'll devote, some time to what it means to think like a futurist in one
Yes.
conversation, another one in what it means to see like a futurist, in which we'll unpack some of these models and methods. And then lastly, what it means to lead like a futurist. And we've really had a conversation that addresses each of those.
Yes.
More information about me, the deepest source is going to be on my website, which is CecilySommers.com. Cecily Sommers is my handle wherever you go on social, on LinkedIn. I'm not terrifically active on social channels, but nonetheless, there's good stuff to find there. And then certainly if there are interesting conversations to have, you can always reach me directly. And I look forward to that. I also look forward to our conversations coming up.
Thank you. Thank you. So do I very much. So thank you for the discussion. And I would say just a kind of the last note here that what we really picture in here, I believe, is kind of trying to map out a certain reservoir of wisdom, because wisdom is ultimately what we can reach the highest level of us as a human capacity. And I know that you have been working very hard on understanding exactly what is that reservoir we need to be tapping. But we go more towards that in our next round of discussions. At this point, I really want to once again thank you very, very much, Cecily, and I'm really looking forward to continue discussions with you.
The pleasure and an honor. Thank you.